imagine waking up tomorrow morning,
Yeah.
right? And the foundational rules of your entire society have just evaporated.
Yeah, just completely gone overnight.
Exactly. You check your bank account, and I mean, the numbers are meaningless because the currency has entirely collapsed.
Right.
You look out the window, and the police aren't patrolling anymore. In fact, the local magistrates are the ones actually leading the looting.
Which is just a terrifying thought.
It is. And to make matters infinitely worse, you turn on the news, and there is a hostile, seemingly unstoppable foreign army currently marching down the highway directly toward your city.
Yeah, the ultimate nightmare scenario.
So what do you do with your mind in that moment? Like, how do you process a reality where every single institution you relied on to keep you safe, your government, your economy, your justice system, has completely failed you?
It is a state of absolute, total systemic collapse. And, you know, when human beings hit that wall, the natural psychological reactions usually fall into one of two camps.
Right. Which are what?
Well, you have total despair and cynicism where you just completely give up. Or, on the other end, a kind of frantic, delusional denial.
Yeah, pretending it's fine when the house is on fire.
Exactly.
And navigating that exact nightmare is exactly why we are taking you on a uniquely custom-tailored deep dive today.
Yeah.
Because we aren't just going to talk about hypothetical collapse.
Right, we have an actual historical survival guide for this.
We do. We are diving into Chris R. Vilas's survey of the Book of Habakkuk.
And right out of the gate, we really need to clarify what this text is and what it isn't.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you hear, the Book of Habakkuk, and you immediately picture a dry, polite, perfectly sanitized religious sermon.
You need to throw that image out the window entirely.
Yes, forget the polite Sunday school lesson.
The mission today is to extract a timeless blueprint for navigating a world that feels like it's falling apart.
Yeah.
Because the text we are looking at, this ancient document from the late 7th century BCE, is gritty.
Very gritty. It is sweating, bleeding, and desperately honest.
It is a man standing in the rubble of his society and having a literal screaming argument with the heavens.
Yeah, he is not holding back.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are talking about a guy watching his entire civilization rot from the inside while a hyper-violent empire marches toward his front door.
And the genius of our source material, Vilas's survey, is how it frames this exact tension. This text represents what we can call a profound legal theological crisis.
A legal theological crisis. I like that phrasing.
Right, because the author, Habakkuk, is watching his society disintegrate, and the book actually documents a psychological and spiritual movement.
He doesn't stay in the same headspace the whole time.
No, he moves from absolute terrified perplexity to a place of deeply anchored trust. He is effectively teaching the faithful how to wait for justice when the system is completely and utterly broken.
I promise you, by the time we wrap up this deep dive, you're going to understand how an ancient geopolitical power vacuum, some dead fig trees, a pile of broken pottery, and a very mysterious Hebrew word hold the absolute key to surviving institutional failure today. It really is an incredible journey.
So, to understand why Habakkuk is standing there demanding answers from the universe, we first have to understand the crumbling, terrifying world he is standing in.
We have to talk about the dirt, the blood, and the geopolitics.
Exactly. The context of the chaos.
It is absolutely essential. I mean, you cannot read this text in a vacuum because the text is a direct reaction to a specific historical trauma.
Right.
The background provided in our source material places Habakkuk squarely in the late 7th century BCE. And, if you were to pick a time in ancient history to be alive,
this would be the worst possible choice.
One of the absolute worst. This was an era of massive continental tectonic plates shifting. The geopolitical upheaval was unprecedented.
Yeah, I was reading through the historical timeline in the notes, and it's not just one bad thing happening. It's dominoes falling across the entire known world.
Totally.
Let's start with the Assyrian Empire, because they were the big bad guys for a long time. Yes. For centuries, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had been the undisputed, terrifying superpower of the ancient Near East.
And they were brutal, right?
Beyond brutal. They were known for sheer terror tactics, calculated state terror, mass deportations. They literally flayed their enemies alive.
Wow. Okay, so just absolute monsters.
They were the dominant force that everyone else had to pay tribute to, but empires always overextend themselves.
They always do.
And in the late 7th century BCE, they begin to collapse. The defining moment comes in 612 BCE when their great, supposedly impenetrable capital city, Nineveh, actually falls to a coalition of their enemies.
Which, I mean, for a brief shining moment must have felt like the greatest news in the world to all the smaller nations they had been oppressing.
Oh, imagine the relief. The great monster is finally dead.
But the problem with ancient geopolitics, and honestly modern geopolitics for that matter, is that whenever a massive power vacuum opens up, someone even more ruthless steps in to fill it.
Right, it's never just peace and harmony afterward.
No, the lions die, and the wolves immediately start fighting over the carcass. And in this case, the two big wolves are Egypt coming up from the south and Babylon coming down from the north.
Exactly. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, or the Chaldean Empire as it's sometimes called, is rapidly ascending as the new superpower.
They want the top spot.
They want to inherit all that Assyrian territory. Egypt wants the exact same territory. And this massive clash of titans culminates at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE.
That's a huge turning point, right?
It is. Babylon decisively defeats Egypt, and in doing so, they cement their absolute dominance over the entire region.
Which brings us to the tiny kingdom of Judah. Because Judah's geography is basically a historical curse.
It really is the worst real estate in the ancient world.
I always pictured Judah's situation like a tiny local mom-and-pop shop that happens to be physically located right in the middle of a narrow alleyway connecting two massive, warring, multinational mega corporations.
That is a perfect analogy.
You've got Egypt to the south, Babylon to the north, and the only way they can get to each other to conduct their hostile, violent takeovers is by marching their armies directly through your living room.
Yeah, Judah is just perpetually caught in the crossfire. They are a buffer state.
Like, they don't really stand a chance militarily, do they?
Not at all. They don't have the capacity to fight either of these empires. Their only survival strategy for decades had been paying exorbitant tribute, basically mafia protection money, to whoever was the biggest threat at the moment.
Right. Please don't crush us. Here's all our gold.
Exactly. But the external threat, this existential dread of the Babylonian war machine advancing south, is really only half the story.
Yeah, let's drill down into that, because the internal reality of Judah is just as bleak, if not worse.
Much worse, in many ways.
The nation is being run by a king named Jehoiakim. And our source material does not mince words about this guy. He is overseeing a highly corrupt, exploitative administration.
He is a terrible leader for a crisis moment.
But I have to push back here for a second, or at least play devil's advocate.
Sure, go ahead.
If there is a literal, hyper-violent empire marching towards your borders with siege engines and archers, who cares if the local courts are a little corrupt? Like, why is the internal corruption of the mom-and-pop shop just as dangerous as the multinational megacorporation coming to destroy it?
It's a crucial question, and it really goes to the very heart of how these ancient people understood their reality.
Okay, how so?
You have to understand the sociological and theological context of Judah. They didn't view themselves merely as a random nation-state with borders and a standing army.
Right.
They understood themselves as a covenant society.
Meaning their entire existence was based on a contract.
Exactly. A literal contract with their God, formalized centuries earlier at Mount Sinai.
Okay.
The foundation of their security, their prosperity, and their right to even live in the land was explicitly tied to maintaining this covenant. And the terms of that covenant were laid out in the Torah, the law.
But here's the key, right? We tend to think of religion today as private morality. Like, did you pray today? Did you harbor bad thoughts?
Right, highly individualized.
But in Judah, the Torah was the civil code.
Yes, it was everything. It was the building code, the agricultural guidelines, the economic regulations, and the criminal justice system. The expectation was that the Torah must function as public justice.
So when the Torah says, do not exploit the widow and the orphan, that isn't just a nice suggestion for personal charity.
No, absolutely not.
That is the baseline legal requirement for their society to even exist.
Precisely. If a wealthy landowner tried to steal the ancestral farm of a poor family, the local magistrates at the city gates were legally, covenantally obligated to stop him.
The law was designed to protect the vulnerable from the powerful.
It was, but what Habakkuk sees all around him is what the source material brilliantly calls Torah paralysis.
Torah paralysis. I mean, that phrase is chilling. The law is frozen.
The system has completely seized up, the courts are totally corrupt, the magistrates are openly taking bribes.
And the king isn't doing anything to stop it.
King Jehoiakim himself is actually building lavish palaces using forced, unpaid labor from his own people, all while the nation is under extreme economic duress from paying that tribute we talked about.
Wow. So the elites are aggressively exploiting the vulnerable, hoarding wealth, and just perverting justice at every level,
Yes, the society is morally and structurally rotting from the inside out.
which means the contract is broken.
Exactly. When the law is paralyzed, the covenant is breached. And in their worldview, a breached covenant invites divine judgment. The protection is lifted.
Oh, I see.
So the internal corruption isn't just a secondary social problem to worry about after the Babylonians are dealt with. The internal corruption is the reason the Babylonians are at the gates.
It's a legal theological crisis of the highest order. That is terrifying. It's the realization that the call is coming from inside the house.
It truly is.
And what I find so deeply compelling about this deep dive is that we aren't just dealing in abstract theology or guessing what this historical atmosphere felt like.
No, we have the actual artifacts.
Right. We have the receipts. The physical archaeology backs up this sense of impending doom in such vivid, granular detail.
It really does. What's fascinating here is how the physical artifacts we've pulled out of the dirt perfectly align with the atmosphere of panic, systemic breakdown, and imminent invasion that we read about in Habakkuk's text.
I was reading about the Babylonian Chronicle in our notes, and I was just blown away by the reality of it. I mean, we actually have the enemy's after-action report.
Yes, we do. Housed right now in the British Museum is a clay tablet known as the Babylonian Chronicle, specifically the artifact designated BM 2946.
And this isn't a religious text, right?
Not at all. It is a secular Neo-Babylonian historical administrative record, and it explicitly, coldly documents King Nebuchadnezzar's first military campaign against Jerusalem in 597 BCE.
It's the physical proof of the monster, the actual logbook of the invasion.
It's hard, undeniable evidence of the Babylonian military machine advancing exactly as the geopolitical tectonic plates suggested they would.
But while the Babylonian Chronicle gives us the view from the empire, we have other artifacts that give us the view from the victims, which is even more intense.
Yes, the Lechish letters.
I got completely lost in researching these because they are so human and so desperate. We were talking about broken pieces of pottery, right?
Yes, they are called ostraca.
Ostraca, okay.
In the ancient world, papyrus and animal parchment were highly expensive materials, usually reserved for official scrolls or wealthy people.
Right, you wouldn't waste that on a quick note.
Exactly. If you needed to dash off a quick note, or in this case, a frantic military dispatch, you would grab a broken piece of a clay jug, dip a reed pen in ink, and just write on the pottery shard.
And archaeologists found a bunch of these.
Yes, a cache of these early 6th century BCE ostraca at the ruins of Lachish.
And Lachish was important.
Very. It was one of the last major fortified cities in Judah, standing between the Babylonians and Jerusalem.
And when you read the translations of these letters, I mean, the hair on your arms just stands up. They contain the actual military communications from the final days of the crisis before the Babylonian destruction.
It's incredible to have that level of detail.
It's commanders writing to one another as the perimeter is literally collapsing. There's one where a commander essentially writes, "We are watching for the fire signals of Lachish because we can no longer see the signals of Azekah.
Right. Meaning, the neighboring fortress has already gone dark.
The enemy has taken it. They are next."
That is the ancient equivalent of a frantic, static-filled radio transmission saying they've breached the perimeter, we are falling back.
It grounds the prophetic text in a very harsh, blood and dirt material reality. The fear Habakkuk is articulating isn't a metaphor. It is the literal smell of smoke on the horizon.
Absolutely.
And alongside the dirt of the history, I was geeking out over the physical history of the text of Habakkuk itself. Because this wasn't just some obscure diary that got lost in the shuffle. People clung to this document.
They absolutely did.
I saw the notes mentioning Dead Sea Scroll fragments. So we have physical pieces of this text from Doomsday Caves.
We do. In the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, archaeologists found fragments of Habakkuk.
Wow.
We have fragments like 4Q82 and 4QXIIG, which date back to around 25 BCE. We also have a Greek translation fragment found at a site called Nahal Haver, dating to the late 1st century BCE.
What does that tell us, that we have all these copies?
It shows that the text was carefully, painstakingly preserved and circulated by different communities very early on. It was highly valued.
But the most amazing one, and you really have to explain this to me because the concept is wild, is the one they call the Pesher.
Ah, yes, 1QP-Hab, the Pesher Habakkuk found in Qumran Cave 1.
What does Pesher actually mean? Because it sounds like it's more than just a copy of the book.
It is much more than a copy. The Hebrew word pesher basically means interpretation or commentary.
Okay.
This document, which dates to the 1st century BCE or CE, is a nearly complete running commentary on the first 2 chapters of Habakkuk.
So they were doing deep dives even back then.
Yes. The Qumran community, often identified as the Essenes, who had retreated to the desert because they believed the Jerusalem establishment of their own day was completely corrupt, didn't just preserve Habakkuk like a museum piece in a glass case. They aggressively interpreted it.
Meaning they applied the ancient text to their modern problems.
Exactly. They treated it as a living, breathing oracle. When Habakkuk talked about the wicked exploiting the righteous, the Qumran community said, aha! The wicked is the corrupt high priest in Jerusalem right now, and the righteous is our own leader, the teacher of righteousness.
That is fascinating.
They mapped the geopolitical trauma of the 7th century BCE directly onto their own sectarian conflicts centuries later.
They saw themselves in the text, they looked at their own failing institutions, their own corrupt leaders, and they used Habakkuk as the lens to understand their reality.
Which is exactly what makes the text so timeless.
And it's exactly the mission we are on today. We were doing exactly what they did. So we have this horrifying historical backdrop. The geopolitics are collapsing, the local government is hopelessly corrupt, the social contract is paralyzed, and there is a superpower marching toward the city gates.
The stage is set.
Now we finally open the book itself, and the way this document begins is a massive shock to the system, because it completely subverts what you expect a prophet to do.
It really does subvert expectations. Usually we think of a prophet as someone who stands in the town square, faces the people, and delivers a message from God.
Right? Hear ye, repent of your sins, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
But Habakkuk doesn't do that. He completely ignores the crowd, he turns around, marches right up to the heavens, and essentially interrogates his creator. He puts God on trial.
The book opens with a very specific, heavy Hebrew word, masa.
Masa, what does that mean?
It is often translated as oracle, but a more literal rendering is burden. It implies a heavy, crushing, prophetic speech that the prophet has to carry.
Almost like a physical weight.
Yes. And as you noted, Habakkuk's first complaint, which makes up verses 2 through 4, is directed squarely at God.
What does he say?
He looks at the domestic violence, the rampant injustice, and the total failure of the judicial system we just talked about, and he screams, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save?"
It's wild to me that he is allowed to speak this way. Like, if I had stood up in my church growing up and aggressively accused God of ignoring violence and failing to do his job, I would have been escorted out of the building immediately.
Most modern people would be very uncomfortable with it, yes.
We are conditioned by polite religion to think that biblical figures are supposed to be quietly, passively submissive at all times. But Habakkuk is deeply angry.
He is furious. And to understand why this isn't considered blasphemy, we have to understand the theology of what scholars call faithful lament.
Faithful lament, unpack that for us, because those two words seem like opposites.
In modern religious polite society, perhaps. But in the ancient framework of the covenant we discussed earlier, honesty about suffering is not rebellion.
Okay.
The text operates on the profound assumption that God's silence in the face of systemic injustice is a massive crisis, and it's a crisis that the faithful should bring into prayer.
So you're supposed to complain.
Think about it like a legal contract. If one party isn't fulfilling their end of the bargain, the other party has the right to file a grievance.
Oh, wow. So he is literally holding God to the terms and conditions of the Sinai contract.
Exactly. He is saying, you gave us the Torah, you commanded justice, you promised to protect the vulnerable, and right now the law is completely paralyzed, the wicked are swallowing up the righteous, and you are doing nothing. Where are you?
It's an indictment.
It is covenant protest. The grievance is actually an act of faith because it assumes God is actually there, actually cares, and is capable of fixing it.
That completely flips the script. The questions aren't the opposite of faith. The interrogation is the pathway into it. It's almost like he cares about God's reputation more than God seemingly does in that moment.
That's a great way to put it.
So Habakkuk demands an answer. He demands an explanation for the paralysis of the courts and the corruption of the elites. And eventually, God does answer him. But the answer he gets is a massive, terrifying, Twilight Zone-level plot twist.
It is absolutely not the comforting reassurance Habakkuk was hoping for.
Right.
God doesn't say, you're right, Habakkuk, I'm going to send a revival, reform the courts, and heal the land.
That would be the expected nice answer.
Instead, God says, essentially, Look at the nations and be astounded. I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told.
And what is the work?
He is raising up the Kasdim, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians.
The ultimate bad guys.
God says he is sending this hyper-violent, ruthless, arrogant empire to sweep across the map and judge Judah.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the logic of this answer is mind-bending. I have to push back here. And honestly, Habakkuk pushes back too in his second complaint.
He certainly does.
How in the world can a holy, just God use a pagan empire that is demonstrably worse and more violent than Judah to punish Judah? It feels entirely disproportionate.
It feels completely wrong.
Yeah. Yes, Judah has corrupt magistrates and greedy elites. But Babylon flays people alive. They impale prisoners. They burn entire cities to ash. It's like discovering you have a termite problem in your house, and your landlord's solution is to call in an airstrike to level the entire neighborhood.
That is the perfect analogy, and it isolates the ultimate theological scandal of the book.
Habakkuk must have been horrified.
He is appalled. He basically says, your eyes are too pure to look on evil, so why are you looking idly at traitors and staying silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?
He's saying the cure is worse than the disease.
Exactly. It forces us to confront a major, deeply uncomfortable biblical theological principle, the concept of divine sovereignty over geopolitics.
Meaning God can use bad actors to accomplish his goals.
Yes, but with a very specific, carefully balanced mechanism. The text asserts that God's sovereignty allows him to employ one wicked power to discipline another without ever endorsing or sharing in the wickedness of that power.
So God isn't looking at Babylon and saying, I love your methods, keep it up.
Absolutely not. Babylon is on a leash, even if they don't know it.
Okay.
The text describes them vividly. They are a bitter and hasty nation. Their horses are swifter than leopards, they scoff at kings, and they gather captives like sand. They are an unstoppable force of nature,
Right.
but they are moving under divine permission. They are a temporary, terrifying instrument of judgment against the systemic corruption of Judah.
But the obvious problem is Babylon doesn't think they are an instrument of Judah's God. Babylon thinks Babylon is God.
Exactly. The text explicitly says their own might is their God. They attribute their military success to their own idols and their own brilliance. And this is crucial. Because of this ultimate hubris, because of their extreme violence, the text makes it crystal clear that Babylon itself will eventually face total judgment.
They are accountable for the blood they spill, even if God used them to spill it.
Yes. They are permitted to conquer, but they are not exempt from ultimate moral accountability. Their arrogance guarantees their own future destruction.
Okay, I understand the theology of that. But for Habakkuk, standing in the late 7th century BCE, this philosophical explanation doesn't help his immediate reality.
Not at all.
The answer is completely unpalatable. Habakkuk is totally unconvinced. He cannot stomach the idea that this bloodthirsty machine is going to be allowed to swallow up his people, corrupt as they may be.
Right.
He refuses to just nod politely and accept it. And this brings us to a massive shift in the text. Habakkuk realizes he can't win the argument right now, but he refuses to abandon it. So he decides to take physical and spiritual action. He decides to stake out a position.
This is one of the most famous images in prophetic literature. He says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me.
The watchtower.
Yeah.
I find this psychological posture so brilliant.
It is very unique.
He doesn't throw a temper tantrum and abandon his faith because God gave him an answer he hated. And he doesn't slip into cynical apathy like, well, whatever happens, happens.
No, he doesn't do either.
He actively builds a watchtower. He essentially says, I don't like your answer, God. It makes zero logical or moral sense to me. But I'm going to stand right here, plant my feet, and wait until you give me an explanation that actually reconciles your justice with this reality.
It is an incredibly mature posture. It is simultaneously epistemological meaning, a quest for true knowledge, and spiritual.
He's demanding to know the truth.
Yes. He waits to hear. He acknowledges his own limitations. He can't force the universe to conform to his timetable, and he can't dominate the outcome, but he actively waits for divine revelation.
And remarkably, God honors that posture. God responds.
He does.
And what does he say?
God tells Habakkuk to write down the shazan, the vision, and he tells him to make it plain on tablets.
Write it so large that he who runs may read it. I've always loved that phrasing. It means make the letters so big on the billboard that a guy sprinting past it in a panic can still read the message.
Precisely. It needs to be an undeniable public declaration. And God provides a profound paradigm-shifting assurance.
What is the assurance?
He says, "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay."
So justice is coming.
The fulfillment of universal justice is certain, even if the timeline is agonizingly slow from a human perspective. And then, right after that, we hit what is arguably the crux of the entire book.
The big moment.
It's one short sentence that changes the course of religious history. Habakkuk 2.4.
Let's zoom way in on this because, as our source material points out, everything hangs on this verse.
The verse provides the central contrast of the entire book. It says, "Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith."
Okay, let's break that down.
The first half of the verse is diagnosing the proud, arrogant oppressor, the Babylonians, or really the anti-type of covenant fidelity anywhere. Their core issue is arrogance. They are self-sufficient and rapacious.
But then comes the contrast.
Right. The tzaddik, the righteous person, shall live.
And they shall live by emunah. This is that mysterious Hebrew word I teased at the very beginning of the deep dive.
It is a very debated word.
And this raises an important question. What exactly does emunah mean? Because I know scholars have fought over this word for centuries.
They absolutely have. The semantic range of emunah is wide, and the debate is intense. In English, we usually just translate it as faith.
Right, which sounds simple enough.
But in our modern context, faith has been flattened out to mean cognitive belief. Like, I have faith that the earth is round, or I believe these theological propositions are true in my brain.
Intellectual assent to a checklist of doctrines.
Exactly. But that is not what omina means here. Other scholars translate it as faithfulness, emphasizing outward actions, loyalty, and moral obedience.
So how should we understand it in Habakkuk?
The best way to understand it, especially given the context of this book, is steadfast trust, or faithful endurance.
Endurance. I like that.
Look at where he is. He is a man standing in a watchtower, staring at a horizon where a terrifying army is about to appear, and he has just been told that justice is going to be massively delayed. In that specific context, emunah isn't just believing God exists.
Right, he already knows God exists. He's been yelling at it for 2 chapters.
Exactly. Emunah here means survival through relentless, white-knuckled endurance and loyal trust.
Just holding on for dear life.
Yes. It is the grit to maintain your loyalty to the covenant even when the institutions have collapsed and the sky is falling. It means the faithful will survive the coming geopolitical earthquake, not by building better weapons, but by continuing to trust God's ultimate justice while living loyally under the agonizing delay.
It's not just an intellectual state, it's an active survival mechanism.
Yeah.
It's tying yourself to the mast of the ship during the hurricane.
That's a great image.
And immediately following this profound, quiet statement about endurance, the text completely shifts gears. God flips the script on Babylon, we leave the watchtower, and we enter a cosmic courtroom.
Yes. Having established how the righteous survive, God now turns his full devastating attention to the oppressor. We enter the section known as the 5 woes, spanning the rest of chapter 2.
The 5 woes.
This is where God puts the Babylonian Empire, and by extension, the mechanics of every corrupt, extractive human empire in history on trial.
It's a series of woe oracles. And as we walk through these, I want you, the listener, to pay close attention. Because while we are talking about 7th century BCE ancient history, I guarantee you're going to recognize the exact same mechanics operating in modern corporate monopolies, corrupt governments, and systemic exploitation today.
The parallels are striking.
The technology changes, but the human greed is identical. Let's look at the first woe.
The first woe exposes acquisitive greed. The text says, "Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own and loads himself with pledges."
Meaning debt.
Exactly. This is targeting the sheer, endless accumulation of wealth through extortion. In the ancient Near East, empires operated essentially as massive protection rackets.
Like the mafia.
Yes. They demanded heavy tribute from smaller nations, forcing them into crushing debt. The pledges refer to the collateral taken from the vulnerable.
It's the ancient equivalent of predatory lending on a national scale. You force a smaller nation to borrow just to pay your taxes, and when they default, you take their land and their people. It's an insatiable appetite for accumulation that eventually destroys the very economies it feeds on.
Exactly right. And that leads directly to the second woe. which focuses on predatory architecture and exploitation.
Predatory architecture.
Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm.
Setting his nest on high. That is such a vivid image. It sounds like billionaires building bunkers.
It's exactly that. It's about systemic corruption designed to insulate the elite from the disasters they create. The empire extracts wealth from the margins, from the vulnerable, to build massive fortified citadels for the rulers.
They're stealing from the poor to build high walls.
They build their security on the physical and economic ruin of others. They think their wealth makes them untouchable.
But the text says the very stones of the walls will cry out against them. The materials used to build their safe houses are fundamentally corrupted by the way they were acquired.
Yes.
And how are they acquired? That's the third woe. Violent urbanism.
Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity.
Wow.
We marvel today at the ruins of ancient Babylon, the massive walls, the hanging gardens. But this woe is the brutal recognition that the great architectural and infrastructural achievements of the empire are built entirely on slave labor, displacement, and bloodshed.
The city is a monument to violence.
It is the dark underbelly of civilization. Behind every grand palace is a trail of crushed human beings.
But the fourth woe takes this physical violence and moves into psychological and sociological terror. And we really spend some time here because this is about honor and shame.
Yes. The fourth woe states, "Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness."
Now, to a modern reader, this might just sound like a bizarre frat party gone wrong.
Oh, it sounds strange to us, yes.
But in the ancient Near East, this is describing a specific, calculated method of psychological warfare. Our source material emphasizes how intimately tied this is to honor-shame dynamics. Can you ELI 5 explain, like I'm a 5, how honor and shame function in this culture?
Absolutely.
Because we tend to think of shame as just an internal feeling, like, oh, I feel embarrassed. But back then, it was much more than that, right?
Far more. In the ancient Mediterranean and in Near Eastern worldview, honor was not just an emotion, it was a tangible currency.
A currency.
Yes, it was your social capital, your legal standing, your economic viability, and your family's right to exist in the community. To possess honor meant you were protected. To be shamed was to be socially and economically annihilated.
So when a conquering army came in, they didn't just want to take your gold.
Taking the gold was the physical conquest. Taking your honor was the psychological conquest. When the text talks about making neighbors drunk to gaze on their nakedness, it is using a metaphor for how empires deliberately humiliate their victims.
How does they do that?
Conquering armies would strip prisoners of war naked, parade them through the streets, and subject them to public mockery and sexual violence.
It was designed to completely destroy the human dignity of the conquered people.
Precisely. Imperial accumulation and violent extraction weren't just about taking resources, they were about emasculating and humiliating the vulnerable.
Breaking their spirit.
Stripping a conquered people of their dignity ensures they will never rebel because they have been fundamentally broken. And this is the exact opposite of the covenant fidelity that God demands in the Torah, which is obsessed with protecting the dignity and physical boundaries of the vulnerable.
So what is God's verdict on this?
God is saying to Babylon, because you stripped others of their dignity, you will be stripped of yours. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory.
That is heavy. It's a complete reversal of fortunes. The humiliator will be humiliated.
Yes.
And then we reach the grand finale of the courtroom scene. The fifth woe, the culminating critique that underpins all the other sins, idolatry.
The root of it all.
Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there's no breath at all in it.
It points out the sheer, pathetic absurdity of the imperial project.
It really does make them look ridiculous.
The Babylonians construct these massive, terrifying systems of extraction and war, and then they literally bow down to chunks of wood and stone that they themselves manufactured. They create their own gods to justify their own violence.
I think about this constantly when I look at modern society, because it's easy for us to read about ancient people bowing to wooden statues and feel very superior, like, oh, how primitive.
We think we've outgrown it.
Right. But we do the exact same thing, just with different materials. We fashion massively complex systems with human hands, the
Yeah.
stock market, artificial intelligence, hypercapitalism, political ideology.
It's all manufactured by us.
We pour all of our trust, our time, and our resources into these systems. We look at the algorithm and effectively say, awake, save us, optimize our lives.
That is a brilliant connection.
Yeah. But ultimately, they are manufactured constructs. They have no breath in them. They possess no inherent moral compass. And when the chips are down, when the economy crashes or the systemic collapse happens, those systems are dead silent. They cannot speak and they cannot save.
It's a very apt, chilling analogy. Human empire, no matter how technologically advanced, is temporary, and its idols are fundamentally mute.
Mute and useless in a crisis.
And Habakkuk powerfully contrasts the dead, hollow silence of these manufactured systems with the terrifying, authoritative silence demanded before the living God.
Right at the end of the chapter.
The chapter ends with this massive, sweeping mandate in verse 20. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him.
The idols can't speak, but before the true God we shouldn't speak. The argument is over. It's this ultimate mic drop moment. God has vindicated his justice. Babylon is doomed. The righteous will live by their steadfast trust.
The case is closed.
But, and this is the massive tension that brings us to the climax of the book, having this theological clarity doesn't change the immediate material reality.
No, it doesn't stop the army.
Habakkuk now has the vision. He knows the end of the story. But in the immediate future, his nation is still going to be invaded. The Babylonians are still going to breach the walls. Jerusalem is still going to burn. The economy is still going to suffer a catastrophic collapse.
Yes. The theological answer resolves the crisis of the mind, but it does not stop the approaching disaster. The invasion is still imminent.
So the burning question is, how does a person mentally and spiritually process inevitable, unavoidable doom? When you know the collapse is coming and you cannot stop it, how do you keep your mind intact? How do you sing in the ruins?
That is the hardest question of all.
That brings us to the final section of the text, which is the ultimate practical test of everything Habakkuk has just learned.
And literarily, this final section is fascinating because it shifts entirely in genre.
It looks totally different on the page.
The first two parts of the book are dialogue, complaint, and divine oracle. But the third part becomes a prayer, or more accurately, a public psalm. It is heavily shaped by what scholars call theophanic, divine warrior imagery.
Let's unpack those terms. Theophanic means a visible, overwhelming manifestation of God. And the divine warrior imagery, what does that look like in the text?
Habakkuk recounts a vision of God moving across the earth. But he's not portrayed as a quiet, gentle shepherd here. He is portrayed as a terrifying, cosmic warrior coming to judge the earth and save his people.
Very intense imagery.
The text uses intense geographic imagery, tracing a path from Teman and Mount Paran regions to the south.
Which is a direct callback to the Exodus, right, to Mount Sinai.
Exactly. It evokes the foundational memory of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. Habakkuk is remembering the ancient stories of God splitting the sea, making the mountains tremble and crushing the oppressors.
He's looking back to find strength for the future.
He recalls the plagues, the pestilence, and the lightning. He is summoning the historical memory of God's saving power to anchor his mind against the coming Babylonian terror. And what is structurally fascinating is that this personal vision is filled with musical and liturgical cues.
Yeah, I noticed that. You see the word Selah pop up 3 times, which most people know from the Book of Psalms as a musical pause or a crescendo.
Right.
And it opens with a very obscure instruction.
Yeah.
Shikianon.
Which our source material notes is a highly uncertain musical or liturgical term, possibly indicating a specific rhythm or a highly emotional style of lament.
But the presence of these musical notations raises a major question.
It does.
If this whole book has been a deeply intimate, personal, agonizing diary of one man screaming at God from a watchtower, why does it suddenly look like a piece of formal sheet music designed for a public choir?
That is the center of a major ongoing scholarly debate. Because it looks so different in form and vocabulary, many critical scholars argue that this final section is a later literary addition.
Someone else added it.
They suggest it was an independent, inherited hymn that a later editor tacked onto the end of Habakkuk's dialogue to give it a more liturgical, rounded ending.
Like a post-credit scene added by the studio to tie up the movie.
In a way, yes. But more conservative scholars, and those focused on the final literary shape of the text, argue that it preserves the prophet's own liturgical theology.
But regardless of its exact composition history, the canonical reading, meaning how the final text functions as a whole, is brilliant.
It truly is.
Because what it does is transform the private, agonizing struggle of the prophet into a public worship guide for suffering people. The personal survival manual has been set to music so the entire community can sing it together when the Babylonians finally breach the walls.
It provides the community with the vocabulary they need to survive the trauma.
And that song builds to what I think is one of the most breathtaking, gut-wrenching climaxes in all of ancient literature. I'll read these final verses because the imagery is so stark.
Please do.
After describing the terrifying power of God, Habakkuk turns his eyes back to the immediate physical reality of his farm and his country. He says, "Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls."
We really need to pause and explain the sociology and economics here because modern readers in industrialized societies can completely miss the gravity of that list.
Yeah, this isn't just complaining about inflation at the grocery store. This isn't, oh, the price of avocados went up.
Not at all. Judah was a highly precarious agrarian peasant economy. The vast majority of the population lived on subsistence farming.
Meaning they ate what they grew, and if they didn't grow it, they starved.
Exactly. Their survival depended entirely on the annual agricultural cycle. This list Habakkuk recites isn't about losing luxury items. It is a systematic, terrifying inventory of total economic collapse.
Let's break it down. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines.
The figs and the grapes were their summer fruits, often dried and stored for essential calories during the winter, or traded as cash crops. When they fail, your economy crashes.
And then the produce of the olive fail.
The olive was arguably the most important crop in the ancient Mediterranean. It provided oil for cooking, oil for lighting lamps, so without it you're plunged into literal darkness, and oil for medicinal purposes.
Yeah.
Losing the olive crop is devastating.
And the fields yield no food.
This refers to the grain harvests, wheat and barley. This is the absolute staple of the ancient diet. Without grain, you have no bread. You cannot survive the winter.
It's just wave after wave of disaster. And finally, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls.
When the sheep, goats, and cattle die or get confiscated by a marauding army, you have lost all your capital, your source of clothing, your milk, and your draft animals used for plowing.
So, to translate this into modern terms, it's like waking up to find you've been fired from your job. The bank has foreclosed on your house, your savings account has been hacked and drained to zero, and your retirement fund just dissolved in a massive stock market crash.
All at once.
All in one single afternoon. Everything you rely on for physical survival, status, and security is completely gone. You are staring into the abyss of total deprivation.
It is the absolute worst-case scenario realized. Yet, in the very next breath, standing in the middle of this imagined total ruin, Habakkuk delivers verse 18, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation."
It gives me chills every time I read it, because it defies all human logic.
It is the culmination of the entire book. The psychological movement is complete. He has moved from furious anxiety and desperate complaint in the first chapter to the quiet endurance of the watchtower in the second chapter, and finally to this defiant, almost irrational praise in the third.
And it is so vital to understand that this is not toxic positive.
Oh, absolutely not.
He isn't closing his eyes, putting his hands over his ears, and pretending the barns are full. He isn't saying, manifest wealth, think positive thoughts, and the Babylonians will go away.
No, he is fiercely realistic.
He is looking dead on at the empty stalls and the dead trees. He is fully acknowledging the horror of his reality.
Exactly. He's not rejoicing because his circumstances have improved. They haven't. In fact, they are about to get infinitely worse.
Right.
He rejoices because he has found an anchor that sits deeper than the economy and deeper than geopolitics. He rejoices because God's character is stable. God is the God of his salvation. Even if the covenant blessings of the land are temporarily suspended because of judgment, the God of the covenant remains.
It is the ultimate expression of emunah, steadfast trust under subsistence-level collapse.
Truly incredible.
And that profound realization brings us to the final part of our deep dive, the ripple effect. Because Habakkuk's ancient survival guide for agricultural and geopolitical collapse didn't just stay trapped in the dirt of the 7th century BCE.
No, it traveled far beyond that.
It became a foundational cornerstone for the entire New Testament and shaped the theology of billions of people over the next 2 millennia.
The legacy of this tiny book is vastly disproportionate to its size. Let's start with its immediate neighborhood in the Hebrew Bible. Canonically, Habakkuk functions as a crucial hinge in what is called the Book of the 12, the collection we often call the Minor Prophets.
Right.
In the traditional ordering, Habakkuk is placed deliberately right between the prophet Nahum and the prophet Zephaniah.
And that placement isn't just alphabetical or random. It tells a story.
It is theologically brilliant sequencing. The book right before it, Nahum, is basically one long celebratory announcement regarding the violent downfall of Nineveh, the old Assyrian oppressor.
The bad guys are dead, yay.
Exactly. And the book right after it, Zephaniah, intensifies the warnings about the coming day of the Lord, a day of universal cosmic judgment against all human wickedness.
So where does Habakkuk fit in?
Habakkuk sits perfectly in the middle, wrestling with the terrifying rise of the new oppressor, Babylon, and acting as the theological bridge. It explains why intermediate judgment is sometimes necessary, but also why faith must endure until that final universal day of the Lord that Zephaniah talks about.
But the ripple effect goes way past the ancient prophets, because that one phrase we spent so much time dissecting, Habakkuk 2.4, the righteous shall live by his faith, it essentially gets copy-pasted and amplified into a megaphone by the writers of the New Testament.
It becomes the programmatic center for massive portions of Christian theology. The Apostle Paul lifts Habakkuk 2.4 and places it at the very core, the very foundation of his arguments in his letters to the Romans and the Galatians.
That's huge.
For Paul, writing in the 1st century CE under the shadow of the Roman Empire, this ancient verse becomes the basis for the doctrine of justification by faith.
Meaning that a person is made right with God, not by perfectly executing a moral checklist or keeping the law, which, as Habakkuk pointed out, human institutions invariably paralyze and corrupt anyway, but by trusting completely in God's provision and grace.
Exactly. Paul takes the concept of immuna, steadfast trust, and applies it to the saving work of Jesus. And then another New Testament author, the writer of the Book of Hebrews, uses the exact same verse in Hebrews chapter 10.
But they use it differently, right?
Yes. There, the emphasis leans heavily into the eschatological endurance aspect we talked about in the Watchtower.
Eschatological meaning related to the end of times, or the ultimate final fulfillment of God's promises.
Right. The author of Hebrews is writing to a community of early Christians who are facing intense persecution, social ostracization, and the seizure of their property. They are experiencing their own version of the fig tree failing.
Their own systemic collapse.
And he uses Habakkuk to essentially say, do not throw away your confidence. You need endurance right now. Remember the prophet. The righteous one will live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him.
So Habakkuk becomes this massive, load-bearing theological bridge connecting the crisis of the Old Testament prophets to the central messages of endurance and grace in the New Testament gospel.
It is a remarkable journey for such a short text.
And speaking of eschatology and the end of the story, we can't wrap up without mentioning what is arguably the most beautiful, sweeping promise in the whole book, Habakkuk 2.1 here. Slotted right in the middle of those terrifying woes against the empire, God says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea."
It's a gorgeous verse.
That is the ultimate horizon. This whole agonizing process isn't just about the tiny mom-and-pop shop of Judah surviving the mega corporation of Babylon. It's about a universal, final, permanent justice. The whole earth soaked in divine glory.
It is a breathtaking vision, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly why Habakkuk remains so pastorally and psychologically indispensable today. The book offers a third way. It refuses two of the most common, deeply flawed human reactions to systemic failure: cynicism and triumphalism.
Let's define those for a second. Cynicism looks at the corrupt courts, the grimy elites, and the rising empires, and says, it's all rigged, it's all broken, God doesn't care, or he doesn't exist, so I'm just going to look out for myself and give up on justice.
Right, that's the cynical path.
Triumphalism is the opposite delusion. It says, we are the good guys, our nation is blessed, we will always win, our economy will always grow, and God is essentially our national mascot.
Exactly. Habakkuk completely rejects both of those toxic extremes.
How does he reject triumphalism?
He rejects triumphalism because he is ruthlessly realistic about human depravity. He looks unblinkingly at the systemic, public, and political evil of his own people, the violence, the greed, the exploitation infecting the courts and the economy. He knows they aren't the infallible good guys.
And how does he reject cynicism?
He fiercely rejects cynicism because he knows that systemic wrongdoing will ultimately be judged. God is not indifferent to the suffering of the vulnerable. He speaks directly to a culture that constantly asks, why evil prospers and why institutions fail.
Which, if we're being honest, is all of us. You, listening right now, whether you consider yourself deeply religious or completely secular. You live in a world where institutions fail,
We all do.
where the justice system sometimes feels paralyzed, where economic exploitation by massive corporations is a daily reality, where the geopolitical news makes you sick to your stomach.
And Habakkuk's ancient warning to you is, do not absolutize any of it. Do not put your ultimate trust in states or markets or political movements or technological systems.
Because they will fail.
Human empire is fundamentally temporary. Its idols are mute. But the universe does bend toward justice, and in the agonizing meantime between the promise and the fulfillment, your calling is emunah, steadfast trust, relentless endurance.
What an absolute roller coaster of a deep dive this has been. Let's just pull it all together. We started in the blood and dirt of the 7th century BCE. We looked at the terrifying geopolitical collapse of Assyria, the rise of the unstoppable Babylonian war machine, and the sheer desperation captured on the broken pottery shards of the Lurish letters.
We examined the profile of a prophet who refused to be polite, a man who engaged in a radical, audacious, screaming argument with God over the paralysis of justice in his own country.
We wrestled with the deeply uncomfortable, scandalous reality that God's sovereignty can utilize the chaos of wicked empires to accomplish historical judgments, while holding those same empires accountable for their violence.
We climbed the watchtower with Habakkuk.
Yes, we sat through the cosmic courtroom of the 5 woes, dismantling the mechanics of greed, elite isolation, violent cities, the weaponization of shame, and the utter absurdity of trusting in manufactured idols.
And ultimately, we navigated that profound, beautiful genre shift in the final chapter, arriving at the realization that the righteous must survive the collapse of the agrarian economy, the failure of the fig, the olive, and the flock, through the psychological and spiritual anchor of loyal, steadfast trust.
Which leads to a fascinating psychological observation about human resilience. We are heavily conditioned to believe that joy, gratitude, and worship are simply the natural byproducts of getting what we want.
Right. It's easy to be thankful when things are good.
When the promotion comes through, when the medical test results are clear, when the bank account is full, and when the politicians we like are in power, we rejoice. It's easy. It requires zero grit.
But Habakkuk demands something else.
The mechanics of Habakkuk teach us something entirely different. They teach us that joy and steadfast trust, when practiced in the dark, are actually profound acts of psychological and spiritual resistance.
They are powerful, defiant declarations made precisely when the visible blessings disappear.
It's the ability to look at a broken, collapsing system, whether it's a national crisis or a deeply personal tragedy, and declare, my anchor is not attached to the deck of the sinking ship. My anchor is attached to something immovable.
It is the ultimate discipline of endurance, learning how to survive and even sing in the tense, agonizing space between the promise of justice and the arrival of it.
Which leaves us with one final practical thought to consider as you go about the rest of your week. Think back to the metaphor of the watchtower.
The central image of the book.
When Habakkuk was handed an answer that made absolutely no sense to him, when the timeline for justice stretched out into a seemingly unbearable delay, he didn't throw his hands up and walk away.
He built a watchpost.
He actively built a watchpost. He staked out a deliberate position of expectant waiting. So, in your own life, when the systems you rely on fail, when the economy shakes, and when the answers to your deepest, most agonizing questions are brutally delayed,
Yeah.
what does your watchpost look like?
It's a question we all have to answer.
When the noise of the panic gets deafening, are you letting the collapse dictate your reality? Or are you finding a way to cultivate the quiet, defiant, relentless endurance of emunah? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.